You may not be here by accident. But you do not have to believe that everything is perfectly arranged either. Sometimes, people simply arrive at the right pause, when the inside has grown tired enough to need listening. If you are a Taurus, and lately you have felt that life is no longer standing still, not loud, not falling apart, just quietly shifting, then this may be the moment to slow down and gently ask yourself where you truly are in your own life. Inner movement does not always arrive with dramatic events. For Taurus, it often comes softly. You wake up one morning and notice you are no longer excited by things that once felt familiar. A conversation that seems ordinary leaves you feeling strangely empty. A silence lasts longer than usual, not out of anger, but because you no longer feel the need to explain. These moments do not need to be labeled as a crisis. They may simply be signs that you have gone far enough in an old role, an old way of living, an old way of enduring. Taurus is naturally drawn to stability. You build, you protect, you maintain. You believe in persistence, in staying, in not giving up too soon. But for that very reason, sometimes you stay longer than necessary, not because you are weak, but because your capacity to endure is greater than most. And at some point, the inner voice begins to speak, not by shouting, but through a gentle, persistent tiredness. This awakening is not a command to change, and it is not a warning that something dramatic is about to happen. It feels more like a quiet question, asked without pressure. Are you still living in rhythm with who you are right now? Not who you were before, not who others expect you to be, but the person you are today, shaped by experience, aware of your limits, and perhaps no longer willing to trade inner peace just to keep things looking fine. When a Taurus begins to awaken, the first shift is rarely action. It is honesty. Honesty about how you truly feel when you are with someone. Honesty about whether you are holding tension just to preserve an image or a responsibility. Honesty in asking yourself, if habit were removed, would I still choose this path? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They only need permission to exist. You may not be ready to change yet, and that is completely okay. Awakening does not mean making sudden turns, cutting things off, or forcing big decisions. Sometimes it is simply the moment you sit still, observe yourself, and do so without judgment. Realizing that feeling different than before is not a betrayal of the past, but a sign of growth. You are not becoming someone else. You are becoming a more honest version of yourself. If this message resonates, let it be a gentle reminder. You do not need to be stronger, try harder, or endure more in order to be worthy. Perhaps what you need right now is permission to listen more deeply, to slow your pace by one breath, to respect the subtle movements within you. For Taurus, change rarely arrives like a storm. It comes like a shift in the wind, soft enough not to knock you down, but clear enough to tell you, it may be time to wrap your soul in a new layer, one that fits who you are becoming. And then, in the days that follow, you may notice that you no longer react as quickly as you once did. Not because you have become indifferent, but because you now pause to observe before letting emotions speak. Stories that once weighed heavily on you now pass by, leaving a brief pocket of silence, just enough for a deep breath, just enough to ask whether you truly need to carry them with you. This quietness is not a retreat from life. It comes from a very natural inner movement, where you are learning to listen to yourself before listening to the world. There are afternoons when you find yourself wanting to be alone more than usual. Not because you dislike anyone, and not because sadness has taken over. You simply need space to sort through thoughts that have been piling up for too long. Silence no longer feels heavy. It feels like a room being slowly cleaned, one drawer opened at a time, each object placed back where it belongs. You speak less about what is still unclear inside, because you know you are still in the process of understanding it yourself. Even tiredness begins to show up differently, not as exhaustion that knocks you down, but as the feeling of energy quietly draining when you try to maintain connections that no longer feel aligned. You begin to notice that some conversations, even when they are not tense, leave you feeling empty afterward. Some relationships, though familiar, no longer offer the sense of safety they once did. What changes most is this: you stop rushing to explain it away. You simply acknowledge the feeling, the same way you notice a shift in the weather during the day. Gradually, selectiveness becomes a natural response. You no longer open the door to every emotion the way you used to, not because you are closing yourself off, but because you understand the value of inner peace. What no longer fits begins to fall away on its own. No arguments, no announcements. Sometimes you simply stop stepping forward, and distance forms quietly, without conflict. If loneliness appears, it carries a different tone now. It is no longer an empty, frightening space, but a necessary pause. In that pause, you reflect on what you have lived through, what once made you proud, and what you accepted for far too long, simply because you believed it was your duty. You begin to see more clearly the line between patience and hurting yourself through prolonged endurance. Your inner world, in its own way, is adjusting its rhythm. Repetitive thoughts are no longer overwhelming, but when they surface, they carry deeper questions. You no longer ask, "Why is everything like this?" but instead, "What is this trying to teach me?" The shift is subtle, so subtle that if you are not paying attention, you might think nothing has changed. Yet that subtlety is the clearest sign that a new awareness is forming. You may not be able to name what you are experiencing, and you do not need to. Some seasons in life are meant to be lived, not defined. Taurus is not in a hurry, and this change does not ask you to move faster. It simply invites you to trust that slowing down, becoming quieter, and choosing more carefully is not a loss. It may be how your soul protects itself, renews itself, and prepares you for a stage where you will move more lightly, yet stand far more grounded than ever before. And within that steadiness, something begins to come into focus, quietly, without any noise. You suddenly realize how familiar your shoulders have become with carrying too much. Not because anyone forced you to, but because you once believed it was responsibility. Duty. The way to keep everything from falling apart. Some of these burdens have been there so long that you almost forgot what it feels like to walk without leaning forward. A soft question begins to rise, barely louder than a passing thought while you sit still. Is this truly mine to carry? Some worries did not come from your heart, but from the desire to keep others comfortable. Some responsibilities were placed on you simply because you were strong enough not to complain. And Taurus, with your patient nature, often accepts them without asking for explanation. But when your inner rhythm begins to change, those burdens start to feel different. Not just tiring, but heavy in a way that is hard to name. As if you are walking a long road with a bag that was never meant to be yours. You no longer see meaning in continuing to hold everything up. Yet you do not rush to let go. You simply begin to notice the difference between effort, born from belief, and endurance, born from habit. Perhaps for the first time, you allow yourself to ask a question you once avoided. If I stop, what will actually happen? Not to test anyone, not to provoke change, but to be honest with yourself. You begin to see that not every relationship needs you as its foundation. Not every problem requires you to step in and fix it. And not every silence is a sign of maturity. Sometimes, it is only the way we delay facing what we already know. Change does not arrive as a firm decision. It comes in small moments. Moments when you no longer automatically take on more. Moments when you choose not to explain yourself. Moments when you listen to your body and your emotions, instead of forcing yourself to be fine. Each time this happens, the weight on your shoulders lightens slightly, even if you do not notice it right away. Realizing that not everything must continue to be carried does not make you irresponsible. It does the opposite. It helps you see more clearly what truly belongs to you and what you have been carrying for others for far too long. And from that clarity, a very small door opens. Not the door to dramatic change, but the door to choice. The choice to move forward with what nourishes you, and to learn, gently, how to set down what has already completed its role in your life. When a few things are set down, even very gently, the space inside begins to change. You may not call it relief yet, but there is a clear sense that you no longer have to tense your body just to keep everything from shifting. In that newly opened space, truth begins to appear in a very different way. Not loud, not dramatic, not through an event that forces you to face it. It arrives quietly, like morning light slipping through the curtains, just enough to reveal details that were once hidden from view. You may start to notice that some people in your life are not bad, but they are no longer right for where you are. Some situations are not wrong, but they are outdated. Some promises, even when spoken with good intentions, no longer carry the weight you once believed they did. This truth does not attack you. It does not demand a reaction. It simply stands there, clear enough that you can no longer pretend you do not see it. And this time, instead of telling yourself you are overthinking, you allow yourself to trust that your feelings have a reason to exist. Taurus often has the habit of explaining things away for others. You try to understand, to empathize, to place yourself in their position, sometimes to the point of losing sight of your own true feelings. But as truth begins to surface, you realize that not everything needs further explanation. Some things only need to be seen clearly. You do not have to prove that you are right. You do not need anyone else to admit anything. The recognition itself is already a significant step forward. There may be a moment when you pause, not because it hurts, but because you are adjusting the way you see your life. Like standing in front of a familiar painting under different light, you begin to notice strokes you had never seen before. At this point, truth does not feel like loss. It feels like a delayed explanation for the fatigue you once carried without being able to name it. And in that moment, your breath becomes lighter, because you no longer need to keep justifying what has been quietly draining you. Intuition, the thing you once doubted, is now met with more respect. Not to turn it into an absolute guide, but to acknowledge that it has been trying to speak to you for a very long time. Those moments when you felt uneasy but chose silence. Those times when you sensed something was off yet stayed anyway, believing patience was required. Looking back now, you no longer blame yourself. You understand that you did the best you could with the awareness you had at the time. Truth, when seen through calm eyes, does not wound. It frees. It frees you from continuing to play the role of the one who endures everything well. It frees you from the repeating question of whether you are too sensitive. It frees you from the need to do everything correctly in the eyes of others. And in that freedom, you do not become cold or distant. You simply become clearer with yourself. You may not have spoken what you have realized to anyone, and that is not necessary. Not every truth needs to be announced. Some truths only need your quiet acknowledgement to change the way you move forward. From there, you no longer try to convince yourself to stay in places that have drained your energy. You also do not rush to leave. You choose to move more slowly, more consciously, more honestly with what you feel inside. In that flow, you begin to feel lighter. Not because life has become easier, but because you are no longer fighting what you already know. Truth does not come to hurt you. It comes to stop you from hurting yourself by denying it. And perhaps right here, a very different kind of peace begins to form. Not the peace of perfection, but the peace of no longer turning your back on yourself. From that sense of peace, something very natural begins to take shape. You no longer feel the need to react immediately when something makes you uncomfortable. Not because you accept everything, but because you understand that not everything deserves your energy. Before, you may have stayed silent to keep the peace, or spoken too much in the hope of being understood. Now, you begin to choose a different path. Quieter, but clearer. There are moments when you realize you no longer want to explain yourself at length. Not because you are closing your heart, but because you have learned to respect what you feel inside. When a boundary is reached, you no longer push yourself to endure more. You pause. You slow your breath. And in that calm space, you allow yourself to say, "This is enough." Not as an accusation, but as a gentle acknowledgement of what you can and cannot continue. Setting boundaries does not happen in a single day. It forms through many quiet moments when you ask yourself what you are truly trying for. In the past, you may have believed boundaries hurt others, create conflict, or signal rigidity. But with time and experience, you begin to see another side. Boundaries, when placed with calm intention, do not push people away. They simply show each person where they stand in your life. Taurus is not someone who enjoys conflict. You value stability and often choose patience to keep things from being disturbed. But patience stretched too far can become an invisible burden. When you begin to honor your own boundaries, you quietly teach others how to treat you. No harsh words, no defensive posture, just consistency between what you feel and how you act. Some people may not be comfortable with this change. They may be surprised when you are no longer willing to do everything the way you once did. But that does not mean you are wrong. It simply reflects that you are no longer standing in the same place. And you do not need to explain that to everyone. Some will understand with time. Others may drift away on their own. Both are natural responses when boundaries are set. Inner peace does not come from pleasing everyone. It comes from refusing to betray yourself just to maintain surface calm. When you allow yourself limits, you allow yourself rest. When you stop trying to fix everything, you create space to care for yourself, to think more clearly, to move forward with a sense of safety that comes from within. And in that flow, you begin to see that self-respect does not make you distant or cold. It makes you more honest, more present, more deeply connected to what truly matters. Boundaries do not close life off. They simply filter what is allowed to enter. So the peace you have just reclaimed can remain longer and no longer be taken from you without your awareness, the way it once was. When boundaries have settled into their rightful place, another process begins, quieter, deeper, like slowly restoring a home after a long time of only opening the door and closing it again in a hurry. You begin to notice very small signals from within. An evening of restlessness that lasts longer than usual, thoughts returning to the same familiar theme. A sense of fatigue, even when your body has not worked hard at all. There is no need to label these experiences with anything dramatic. They may simply be reminders that something inside you is asking to be put back in order. Taurus often carries strength in a quiet way. You are used to enduring and moving forward, so you sometimes overlook the subtle messages your mind sends. But when life slows down, you begin to see that this tiredness is not an enemy. It is more like a soft bell, signaling that it is time to pause and look at what you have been carrying. Some emotions have already served their purpose. They once helped you move through a chapter of your life, but now they only take up space. Some expectations, even those that once pushed you to try harder, now create tension each time you think about them. The process of clearing does not happen by forcing yourself to forget or by demanding immediate positivity. It begins by allowing everything to be present as it is. You may sit quietly with repetitive thoughts, not trying to push them away, simply observing what they are trying to say. You begin to realize that many thoughts do not need answers. They only need acknowledgement, and then they dissolve on their own. When resistance softens, small pockets of space appear in the mind, just enough for your breathing to become steadier. Over time, sleep reflects this shift as well. At first it may still be light and broken, but it no longer feels as heavy as before. You stop carrying the entire day into bed with you. Unresolved matters are allowed to rest outside, waiting for another time. Quiet arrives not because all problems disappear, but because you stop trying to solve everything at once. Taurus, with your practical nature, slowly learns that not every situation needs an immediate answer. As you begin to let go of emotions that have grown old, a gentle feeling enters naturally. Not bright joy, but clarity. You recognize what drains your energy and what nourishes you, even if only slightly. You no longer force yourself to meet expectations that no longer fit, even when they once brought a sense of safety. Instead, you allow yourself to adjust your rhythm. Slower if needed, less if enough. During this clearing, there may be moments when you feel empty, and that does not need to be filled right away. Emptiness is not always a lack. Sometimes, it is the space required for something new to arrive. As the mind grows quieter, you begin to hear your truest desires more clearly, no longer drowned out by obligation or habit. You may not act on them yet, but clarity has already begun to form. This process does not turn you into someone else. It simply brings you closer to yourself. You remain the steady Taurus you have always been, just carrying less weight. You still care deeply about others, but you no longer trade your inner calm for it. And as the mind opens with more space, you begin to understand that peace is not a luxury. It is the result of choosing to clear the inside, little by little, so that what remains truly matters to your life. When things inside have become a little more orderly, even just a little, you may begin to sense something difficult to name, as if you are no longer walking entirely on your own. Not in the sense that someone is constantly beside you, but as a feeling of being supported from a place very deep, very calm. It might be a memory of arms that once protected you in the past, an old piece of advice that suddenly returns at the right moment, or simply a quiet belief that you have not been left behind in the middle of these changes. Taurus usually trusts what can be touched, seen, built step by step. But during this transition, you may notice that not every source of support is visible. Sometimes, a single passing thought is enough to bring you back to center. A moment of stillness in the middle of a busy day, a familiar look in the mirror, a gentle warmth spreading through your chest when you decide not to push yourself any further. These moments do not need explanation. They simply exist, like a reminder that you are not off course. You might call this intuition, inner faith, or a connection to values that have been with you for a long time. You might not name it at all. What matters is that this sense of quiet companionship allows you to slow down without feeling lost. Standing between what is familiar and what has not yet taken shape, you are no longer overwhelmed by fear. You understand that you do not need every answer in order to keep moving. You only need to trust that each step you take comes from honesty with yourself. During days like these, you may find yourself more sensitive to small things. An old song makes you pause a little longer. A simple sentence reaches you more deeply than expected. These moments are not random, and they do not need to be exaggerated. They feel like emotional markers, reminding you that you are slowing down enough to feel, enough to be present. And in that presence, you realize that strength does not come only from endurance, but also from allowing yourself to be supported. Inner faith is not the certainty that everything will work out smoothly. It is the calm assurance that whatever happens, you can face it without losing yourself. You begin to trust decisions that come from stillness rather than pressure or fear. You no longer need someone else to confirm that you are on the right path. Right and wrong are measured by the lightness or heaviness you feel inside when you think about the road ahead. At times, this sense of support shows up in very beautiful silences. When you sit alone without feeling empty. When you do not need to fill time with noise. When you allow yourself to rest without guilt. In those quiet spaces, you can feel clearly that you are being held steady. Not by any outside force, but by a deep connection to who you truly are. And as you move forward through the space between the old and the new, you are no longer in a rush. You understand that you do not have to abandon the past completely to welcome what comes next. You carry with you the lessons that have been distilled, the memories that have softened, and a quiet trust that you are allowed to move at your own pace. This invisible companionship does not push you to move faster. It simply stays close enough so you do not feel alone, and far enough to give you the freedom to explore your own path. In this flow, Taurus becomes grounded in a very different way. Not because the future is certain, but because you trust more deeply in your ability to listen to and support yourself. And perhaps it is this quiet trust that carries you through this transition with calm, with gentleness, and with a deep sense that no matter how life changes, you are still being guided from within, one step at a time, fully human, fully real. And when you look back at the entire path you have just walked, you may realize that what mattered most was never about how the outside world changed. Not about who arrived or who left. Not about what was kept or what quietly closed. The center was always the moment you began to look at yourself differently, with more gentleness, with more fairness, with more honesty. Change, in this sense, does not arrive suddenly. It begins to take root. Taurus does not change because of pressure. You change when you have understood enough, when something no longer needs to be proven, no longer needs to be held on to, no longer needs to be endured just to feel justified. That awareness is quiet. It shows up in ordinary moments. When you notice you no longer react the same way, you stop trying to fix everything. You stop tying your worth to how much you carry for others. And in that moment, you know you have entered a different phase, even if the outside still looks familiar. Understanding your own value does not make you distant or closed off. It helps you tell the difference between what truly nourishes you and what slowly wears you down. You begin to keep what brings you peace, even if it is small. And you gently release what no longer fits, even if it once felt familiar. Not with resentment, but with gratitude. Because everything that once had a place in your life carried meaning, whether as a lesson or as a memory. From there, life does not suddenly turn in a completely new direction. It simply becomes more aligned with who you truly are. The rhythm slows where it needs to slow. It becomes clearer where things once felt uncertain. You stop looking for absolute guarantees. Instead, you trust your ability to adjust, to adapt, and to stand steady. That steadiness does not come from holding everything tightly. It comes from knowing you can let go when it is time. If there is one thing to carry with you, as this story comes to a close, it may be permission. Permission to not always be strong. Permission to pause when you need to. Permission to change without feeling guilty for no longer being who you once were. For Taurus, this is not giving up. It is growth. You do not lose your grounded nature. You simply use it in a softer, more sustainable way. And as you move forward, you may not know exactly what waits ahead, but you know one thing clearly. You will not return to places that require you to abandon yourself. From that awareness, the path opens naturally, not because of luck, not because of destiny, but because you chose to live more closely aligned with your values slowly. Step by step, yet steady enough to keep going, with a calmer state of mind, with deeper presence, and with a way of living that feels honest to your own life.